The 10 dogmas, which are usually taken for granted, are very rarely challenged, and most people don't even realize they're dogmas or assumptions, are as follows. First, that nature is mechanical. The universe is a machine, animals and plants are machines, we are machines. In fact, everything's machinery. This came into vogue in the 17th century, and it was the founding metaphor of the modern sciences. And the reason it became the founding metaphor was that the founding fathers of modern science were breaking away from the older worldview taught in all the European universities and monasteries and schools, which was really a form of Christian animism. In the medieval universities, people were taught that the Earth is a living organism, Mother Earth, that the heavens are alive, the stars are intelligent, that they're populated by minds, angelic minds, that animals and plants have souls. The reason we call animals animals is because they have a soul, or anima, and that human souls were included the plant level of soul, which shapes the form of the body, the animal level of the soul, which underlies the emotions, the instincts, and the senses, and gives us emotions which we share with animals, like fear, lust, anger, etc. The human soul contained a third element, the intellectual or conscious soul, which was to do with reason and was open to the Spirit of God. So the rational mind, which was embedded in a much larger psychic system, which was largely unconscious. The whole of this worldview was animate. The living God was the God of a living world, and the living world was organic and purposeful. Nature had internal purposes. Now, the machine view of nature displaced that, and precisely by getting rid of the souls from nature. And souls were drained out of nature until all that was left was purposeless machinery. Now, of course, machines do have purposes, but they're not inherent to the machines. A car has a purpose. It wouldn't be made otherwise. It's to get you from one place to another. But the car itself has no purpose. Its purpose is external to the car. It's in the minds of its owners or users. The difference with an organism is that organisms have their own goals or purposes. I learned this to my cost when I was I went to a trip in Ireland. In fact, I went to a transpersonal conference in the west of Ireland. And after it, we were offered as part of the program a horse ride around some beautiful Irish mountains. I'd never ridden before, so I was given this horse, and they told me it was a very reliable animal. I sat on it, it seemed to know just what it was doing, and I hoped it would go off with the other horses around these beautiful mountains. But instead, it branched off at a particular junction and confidently walked down the road until it ended up at its stables. And it had a definite idea as to where it wanted to go, whereas if I got in a car, that wouldn't have happened. So the organisms have purposes, machines don't. And so the idea was to drain all the purposes out of nature. And in the 17th century, the founders of modern science were devout Christians, and they thought that by downgrading nature, they could upgrade God. They thought it was pious to take this view because all the purposes of nature were taken out of nature and put in the mind of God. God was the purpose of the whole universe. Before, the animals and plants had all had their own purposes, delegated purposes, ultimately derived from the divine purpose, but inherent in the organisms. This took the purposes out. And it led to a dualistic view of nature, sometimes called Cartesian dualism, which created a duality of a machine universe made of unconscious matter. On the other hand, a world of consciousness or spirit, which consists of God, angels, and human rational minds. And the spirit world was immaterial, outside time and space. The natural world was material, unconscious, and inside time and space. And this created a duality between mind and body, between humans and animals, because we had rational souls, animals didn't. They were just machines. So it was okay to vivisect them. They couldn't feel pain, they couldn't think. And it's okay to grow them in factory farms. The whole factory farming and agribusiness model is based on this mechanistic way of thinking. And third, it created a division between science and religion. Religion got God, angels, and the human spirit, and science got nature. Previously, the spirit pervaded all of nature, and there was no such division. So the first step is the machine metaphor. Nature's mechanical. Most people don't even realize it's just a metaphor or an assumption. They think it's a fact. The second assumption of the 10 dogmas is that matter is unconscious. I've already mentioned that. Descartes defined matter as unconscious and moved the whole of consciousness into this separate category of spirit, God, angels, and human minds. The third assumption is that nature is purposeless, and that follows from the machine as a metaphor. It's not been proved scientifically, it's not been proved to many places of decimals by experiment. It's simply an assumption. If nature is a machine, it has no inherent purpose. So animals have no inherent purpose, plants have no inherent purpose. We ought to have no inherent purpose, but we seem to. That's a problem. And the whole universe and evolution has no inherent purpose. It's just blind chance. Again, this is an assumption based on a metaphor. So the fourth assumption is that the laws of nature are fixed. All the laws of nature, and indeed the constants, were fixed at the moment of the Big Bang and have been the same ever since. In the 17th century, they thought that the laws of nature were ideas in the mind of God, and therefore transcended nature and had the properties of God, universal, omnipotent, and so on. The so-called laws of nature are still believed by most physicists to have those properties. They're believed to be universal, changeless, and so on. In the 17th century, it made sense in terms of a political metaphor. God was like the cosmic emperor, and he was also the cosmic law enforcement agency, so nothing could disobey these laws. So the idea of eternal laws of nature was built into the foundations of science in the 17th century. When the Big Bang theory came in 1966, giving us a vision of a radically evolutionary universe, this, of course, left the eternal laws of nature free-floating with the assumption they must all be there at the very beginning. That was the old assumption of science. The pre-evolutionary view of cosmology was carried over into evolutionary cosmology with this assumption they must all still be fixed, even though the universe evolves. The next assumption is that the total amount of matter and energy is always the same, except at the moment of the Big Bang, when it all suddenly appeared from nowhere. As my friend Terence McKenna used to say, modern science is based on the principle, give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest. And the one free miracle is the appearance of all the laws of nature and all the matter and energy in the universe from nothing in a single instant. And the assumption that the laws of nature are fixed has led modern cosmologists into an extraordinary set of intellectual contortions. If the laws of nature that govern you and me and grass and birds and everything else were all fixed at the moment of the Big Bang in exactly the right way for life to emerge and us to exist, out of all the possible laws and constants that they could have been, why are they just right for us to be here? This is called the cosmological anthropic principle. Why are they right for us? And the usual debate that goes on within modern science, cosmology, and philosophy says there are only two alternatives. First, they must have been fixed in exactly the right way by a kind of deistic God outside nature, an engineering God who fine-tunes the laws and constants to make them exactly right for us, an intelligent designer. Or, for those who don't like the intelligent designer model, and I don't either, I believe in God, but I don't believe that God's an intelligent designing engineer outside the cosmos. The alternative view is that there are billions, quadrillions of actual universes, of which this is only one, and this is the only one fit for us to live in, so it's the only one we can know about, but all the others actually exist. So it's just a matter of chance that we're in the right one. All the others actually exist. I had an argument with the Astronomer Royal in Britain, Lord Rees, who was President of the Royal Society and Master of Trinity College, Cambridge. I mean, he's risen to the highest position he could possibly achieve in the world, in the pecking order of science. And he happens to be an old friend. His wife's the godmother of one of our children. So we were having breakfast one morning. And I said to him, Martin, I can't understand why you want to proliferate universes so endlessly. I mean, trillions, quadrillions of universes. I said, it just seems to me such an extravagant hypothesis. And he said, yes, but this way we can get rid of God. And I said, but surely, isn't this proliferating universes, isn't this the ultimate violation of Occam's razor, the principle that entities should not be multiplied unnecessarily? I agree it's a bit of a problem, we're working on it. But they haven't even got rid of God, because as theologians and philosophers have pointed out, an infinite God would be the God of an infinite number of universes. So all they've done is proliferated universes. There's not a shred of evidence for any of these billions or quadrillions of extra universes. And yet, the majority of cosmologists, at least in Britain, prefer that hypothesis to what they see as the alternative, the intelligent design hypothesis. But both of these ways of thinking, the universal, the multiverse theories, are necessary if we drop the idea the laws of nature were fixed at the beginning, if they're more like habits, something I've been saying for years, and an idea that was proposed first by C.S. Peirce, an American philosopher at the beginning of the 20th century, an idea now taken up by the cosmologist Lee Smolin in his recent book on time. If the laws of nature evolve like habits, they don't all have to be fixed exactly right at the beginning. They don't need an intelligent designer. There can be a creativity inherent in nature, and the laws can stabilize as habits. They're not laws, they're habits. And in fact, the very concept of laws of nature is deeply anthropocentric, like so much of modern science, which claims to have gone beyond these crude, infantile ways of thinking. It's anthropocentric because only humans have laws, and what's more, only civilized humans have laws. Tribes have customs, which are more like habits. And so to say that there are laws of nature is intensely anthropocentric. As C.S. Lewis once said, to say that a stone falls to earth because it's following a law makes it a man and even a citizen. So I think we can simply drop the idea of fixed laws of nature. So anyway, most scientists aren't even aware there's an alternative, that the laws of nature are fixed. It's simply taken for granted. And so it is by most people who've gone to university, because all these assumptions are implicitly built in to the modern worldview. The next assumption is that biological heredity is material. Everything you inherit biologically is inherited materially in DNA, the genes, or more recently in chemical modifications of the genes, epigenetics. But either way, it's chemically inherited, materially inherited. Now, there are many problems with that view, and in fact, the genetic theory of heredity and the neo-Darwinian theory of evolution are coming unraveled at the moment. I may have time to talk about that later, because this is one of the most exciting and interesting developments in the last few years in biology. The whole of the standard evolutionary theory, selfish gene theory, is in disarray. There are hardly any sophisticated evolutionary theorists who any longer believe in old-style neo-Darwinism, because it's simply been superseded. And no one quite knows what to do with these new problems that have arisen. Anyway, I'll leave that aside for the moment. The next assumption is that memories are stored inside the brain. Most people who challenge some of the assumptions of science accept, almost everyone seems to accept, that memories are stored inside the brain. Usually on the grounds of, well, where else could they be? But this is a materialist assumption, because if the mind is the brain, then memories, part of the mind or mental activity, have to be in the brain. And for 100 years, people have tried to find these supposed memory traces in brains in modified phosphorylated proteins, in modified synapses or nerve endings, etc. Over and over again, they've drawn a blank in this quest for the memory traces. But it hasn't put anyone off searching for them. Instead of saying, well, wait a minute, maybe they're not there, the assumption is they must be there. Just give us a few billion more dollars and 10, 20 more years and we'll figure it out. This is an example of promissory materialism. Whenever they don't know the answer, they say, well, we don't know it yet, but we will know it at some undated time in the future. Undated promissory notes against future explanations. That's an assumption. And later today, I may talk about my own hypothesis of morphic resonance. But according to that hypothesis, the brain doesn't store memories. It's like a receiver that tunes into them. They're broadcast across time, as it were, from the past. And the brain picks up memories just as a TV set picks up invisible transmissions. It's a receiver rather than a storage device. Our brains are more like TV receivers than video recorders. And the evidence fits much better with the idea that the brains are not storing memories than it does with the idea that they are in the brain. But again, this is not something that's on the cards within the realm of neuroscience because it's simply too taboo. It goes against this assumption. So billions and billions of dollars, hundreds of billions have been spent on memory research, all on that assumption. Not one penny, as far as I know, has been spent on looking at alternatives to that, because it's so universally assumed that must be true. The next assumption is that the mind is nothing but the brain. I mentioned this earlier. Mental activity is brain activity. This is a consequence of the materialist hypothesis. And the ninth assumption, it follows from the previous one, which is that psychic phenomena like telepathy are illusory. They must be illusory if the mind's nothing but the brain, because thoughts in your mind couldn't possibly have effects at a distance, or contact events in the future, or be influenced by the mind's own future. The general assumption here is that although most people claim to have had telepathic experiences or other psychic experiences, they're simply deluded about their own experience. And when parapsychologists come up with evidence that suggests these things are real, then the people who've come up with the evidence are either fools or frauds. And this evidence is all flawed. And there are entire skeptic organizations designed to counteract any evidence for psychic phenomena. They're very powerful, they're very well organized. The American Committee for Skeptical Inquiry publishes the Skeptical Inquirer magazine, has a circulation of about 60 or 70,000. Michael Shermer's Skeptic magazine has about 50,000. There's over 100,000 card-carrying skeptics in the United States. And the number of full-time parapsychology researchers is about 3. So they're outnumbered 33,000 to 1 by a far better funded organization, these skeptic organizations. Now, the people in these organizations usually know nothing whatever about psychic phenomena. They simply know it must be wrong. I had an argument a couple of years ago with Daniel Dennett, who's a fellow, a materialist philosopher and a fellow of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. And I said to him, Dan, do you think that parapsychology is a pseudoscience? He said, of course it is. He said, because it's investigating phenomena that don't exist. And I said, would you be prepared to defend that position in a public debate? He said, no. And I said, well, why not? He said, well, I haven't had time to look at the evidence. So I said, well, how can you be so sure it's a pseudoscience then? He said, it has to be. He said, because it goes against everything we know about the mind and about nature and the whole of established science. You know, what's more likely to be wrong, the whole of institutional science or a few people weird psychics who think they're having experiences that they can't really properly explain. This is, one of the most sophisticated and highly esteemed philosophers in the United States, a leading philosopher of mind. I've had many debates with skeptics, and very few of them rise above that level. If you're interested in seeing a fuller documentation of what the skeptics are up to and where they're coming from, check out a recently developed website called skepticalaboutsskeptics.org. which has a who's who of media skeptics and a portrait of the various skeptical organizations. And the final, last of the 10 assumptions is that mechanistic medicine is the only kind that really works. Alternative and complementary therapies may appear to work, but that's just because people would have got better anyway, or it's nothing but the placebo effect. Now, of course, the placebo effect, which shows the power of mind over healing, is itself an unexplained phenomenon, but nevertheless, it's used to explain away alternative and complementary medicine. And again, this is not just some theoretical assumption believed by a few academics in ivory towers. This is the basis of the entire funding system for medical research and medical training and teaching. In recent years, there have been some improvements, particularly in the United States. The National Institutes of Health have a research budget of $32 billion a year for mechanistic medical research. And they now have a Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine with a budget of $100 million a year. But it's a tiny percentage of the entire budget. But at least there's something. In Britain, we have nothing. The entire Medical Research Council spends hundreds of millions of pounds of public money every year on medical research and not one penny on complementary or alternative medical research, despite the fact that most people in Britain have been to therapists of that kind, one kind of therapist or another. I once asked the Minister of Science in the Labour government, Lord Sainsbury, about his views on this. I suggested that some of the medical research budget should go to look at these phenomena. And he said, what's the point? And I said, because many people are interested in them. And he said, well, it's because they don't understand science. He's not a scientist himself. I don't think he understands very much. But he said, these people are just quacks, so it'd be a waste of money. And that was the end of the discussion. So this affects medical insurance, the National Health Service, medical policies, etc. Of course, these alternative therapies all exist, but most of them are not properly researched or not properly funded through standard national health services or insurance policies. So these assumptions, these 10 assumptions, shape the pre-installed worldview of the average university graduate. Most people emerge from university with these views, at least implicitly, as part of their mindset. And they often defend them because they want to be seen as smart, educated, and modern. But I think every single one of these views is false. And every single one of them, I think, is holding back science and preventing free inquiry into areas where, by breaking out of them, we could make much more interesting discoveries than we're making now. And it's not as if science as presently constituted is working very well. It's obeying the law of diminishing returns. And in think tanks in London and Washington, DC, there's a lot of discussion at the moment about what policymakers call the innovation deficit. The innovation deficit is based on the analysis that first, on the assumption that the West can't compete with China or Asia in general in mass manufacturing of goods or in mass provision of services, because so many of them are outsourced to India or the Philippines or other countries. The West is supposed to be able to compete through innovation, being the leading edge of innovation. But then if you look at where are the innovations, where are the breakthroughs of the last 20 years, breakthroughs of the magnitude of the ones that gave us computers, jet engines, penicillin, the internet, etc., mobile phones. Those were all based on breakthroughs in the 20th century. Where are the breakthroughs of the 21st century? We're always reading in newspapers, breakthrough in cancer research, new gene identified that could help cure cancer, all that kind of thing. But real breakthroughs, real innovations are very, very few and far between. A good place to look at a history of this is a book by Dr. James Lefanu, L-E-F-A-N-U, called The Rise and Fall of Modern Medicine. He's a British doctor who writes a medical column in one of our newspapers, the Daily Telegraph. And what he shows is that the triumphs of modern medicine, the great breakthroughs that transformed medicine, things like vaccination, inoculation, antibiotics, heart transplants, organ transplants, keyhole surgery, etc. Almost all of them took place before 1990. The last great breakthrough, and perhaps one of the least significant, but a serious breakthrough, was the discovery that peptic ulcers are caused by bacteria rather than stress, and they can often be cured by antibiotics. He ranks that as one of the last of the great breakthroughs. But there simply haven't been any big breakthroughs since then, and drug companies have a dearth of new products. Many of their investors are very worried because they're all about to fall off a patents cliff as their blockbuster drugs go off patent. Lipitor, the statins are already off patent, Prozac's off patent. They're obeying a law of diminishing return as well. So all is not well in the garden of science. So I think that challenging these assumptions and looking at alternatives opens up completely new perspectives. I'm just going to deal with one of them in a little bit more detail, and then we'll leave any of the others for my dialogue with Rick and the subsequent session parts of this afternoon. The one I want to look at in more detail is the idea that matter's unconscious. I already said this came into being by definition in the 17th century. But most scientists until the 19th century were dualists. They said, okay, science deals with nature, matter's unconscious, but of course human minds are not just material things, and of course God still exists and our minds can relate to God. But God's separate from nature as our minds are, and our minds, through God-given reason, enable us to dissect and control the natural world. That was the standard assumption, and many scientists were quite devout Christians or Muslims or Jews, or Hindus. They didn't see a conflict because they had two compartments. But in the 19th century, there was a growing movement of people who didn't want there to be two fundamental realities. They thought two was too many. They thought there ought to be just one. Personally, I think two is too few. I'm a Trinitarian, and I think we need to have at least three fundamental principles. But anyway, those who didn't like the untidiness of two, thought there should only be one, and they went in one of two directions. Some people said mind is the only reality. This is the philosophy of idealism. Therefore, everything is mind. Matter's just somehow dumbed down mind. But most 19th century philosophers who wanted a monism, as opposed to a dualism, became materialists. They said that the only reality is matter. The realm of spirit simply doesn't exist. That meant, at one stroke, God and the angels were removed from reality. And an essentially atheistic philosophy came into sway. The main reasons that atheism gained ground in the 19th century in Europe, it never gained much ground in the United States till recently, but in Europe the reason it gained ground was because it provided a very strong ally of political parties that were against the established order. And particularly in countries like France and Russia, where there were reactionary political regimes allied to the established church, in France, the Catholic Church, in Russia, the Orthodox Church. These states were empowered by the belief that they were divinely ordained, and these churches supported the power and reactionary policies of the state. Therefore, for socialist and communist parties, the best way to undermine the power of the established order was simply to say, well, God doesn't exist. It's an illusion. There's no such thing as the realm of spirit. And these churches are just talking about absolute nonsense, superstition, things that don't exist. So this led to a decline in the power and influence of churches, a great decline in religious observance and belief, which has continued to the present day. In Britain, church attendance today is about 7% of the population. In the US, it's about 50%. The US is one of the most religious countries in the Western world. But in most of Europe, it's 10% or below. In Scandinavia, it's about 2%. 98% of the Scandinavian population has no regular religious practice. There are quite a lot of people who are spiritual but not religious, but the effect of this anti-Christian propaganda, especially in 19th century anti-clerical movements on the continent, has been to undermine the power of churches. And so many people adopted a materialist worldview, not because they'd considered the scientific facts, not because they'd thought through the philosophy, but because it was politically expedient and enabled a kind of secular worldview to become mainstream. And that's very much in place all around the world, and it's the standard default worldview of almost all educational institutions, with the exception of CIIS and religious seminaries and a few other institutions. So the idea that matter's unconscious became the only reality when the dualism gave way to the materialism in the 19th century. And in a sense, it was relatively easy to get rid of God and the angels, but they couldn't get rid of human consciousness. And so this then led to what's in 20th and 21st century philosophy of mind called the hard problem. The fact is, we're conscious. And if all matter's unconscious, we ought not to be conscious. So the main effort of materialist philosophers of mind has been to prove that our consciousness either doesn't exist or that it does nothing. Either it's an epiphenomenon, like a shadow of the activity of the brain that does nothing, or it's an illusion produced by what Patricia and Paul Churchland, California's leading philosophers of mind, like to call folk psychology. Ordinary people go on talking in terms of subjectivity, emotions, and so forth. But when materialism achieves its goals, when the promissory notes are fulfilled, we'll realize this is nothing but a kind of deluded shorthand folk language for events that can be objectively described in terms of neuroscience, objectively described in terms of brain functioning. There's a third school of materialist philosophers who say that consciousness is an illusion. My old friend Nicholas Humphrey in Britain is a member of this school. He and I have almost opposite views on almost everything, but we're still friends and we're able to discuss these things. But he says that consciousness is a kind of illusion produced by evolution in the brain. It doesn't do anything, but it makes us feel good and want to get out of bed in the mornings. And it's an illusion that it makes us enjoy the beauty of the world and all that kind of thing, because if we do that, we're happier and tend to survive better. So he gives it a function, but says it doesn't really do anything except make us feel good. The trouble is, to say that consciousness is an illusion is rather self-contradictory, because illusion is a mode of consciousness. It presupposes rather than explains consciousness. Now, because of the extreme problems of materialism, in the last few years there's been a most interesting movement going on. Materialists are jumping ship. And the first to defect from the materialist worldview among materialist philosophers of mind was a British philosopher called Galen Strawson, who argued that materialism implies panpsychism. If psyche exists, if mind exists in humans, it can't just appear miraculously from unconscious matter. There must be proto-mind or lower organizations of mental processes right back into the material world as far as electrons and as subatomic particles. There must be some kind of mental aspect to all nature. A more recent convert to that view is Thomas Nagel, one of America's leading philosophers of mind at Columbia, who 3 years ago produced a book called Mind and Cosmos: Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. Caused a furore among philosophers. He was denounced in the most incredibly inflammatory language by people like Steven Pinker and Daniel Dennett for betraying science, reason, and philosophy. And he's actually an honest man trying to, if you read his book, which I have done, it ends exactly where I'd like it to begin, but you see somebody trying to claw their way out of this materialist trap. And he ends up by saying there must be some other aspect to nature, there must be another way of understanding mind, that panpsychism must be in some sense true, although I don't know quite how it's true and in what way, and there must be some inherent teleology or purpose in nature. He remains an atheist, but he thinks that the facts of the matter force one to those conclusions. Most recently, one of the most hardcore materialist neuroscientists, Christoph Koch, came out in favor of panpsychism in an article in Scientific American last year. And it's now a kind of swelling movement in the materialist ranks. The trouble is that none of them are very clear about how panpsychism might work. And I'm going to end this introductory section by just saying a few words about the most interesting panpsychist philosopher of the 20th century, Alfred North Whitehead. I'm sure you discuss him in your program here. But Alfred North Whitehead was one of the first philosophers to realize the implications of quantum theory, partly because he was the only philosopher who really understood mathematics. He started as a mathematician, and with his student Bertrand Russell, produced a book, Principia Mathematica, a key book in the philosophy of mathematics in the 20th century. When quantum theory got going in the 1920s, Whitehead realized immediately that if electrons and other quantum particles are waves, which is what quantum theory was saying, then they have time within them. You see, previously people thought that matter was made up of solid little bits, like miniature billiard balls, particles that just persisted in time. But if they're waves, they're processes. And as Whitehead pointed out, a wave takes time to wave. You can't have a wave at an instant. You know, just think of waves on the ocean. When you see them, if you had an infinitesimal slice of a wave, it's not a wave anymore. It's, you have to go through at least one wavelength to know that it's a wave or what kind of wave it is, and that one wavelength takes time. So it also means that insofar as quantum particles are waves, you can't precisely localize them in space or time. And this is the ultimate reason for the so-called uncertainty principle in quantum mechanics. Whitehead realized, therefore, that even at the most fundamental level, matter is a process, not a thing. And if it's a process in time. And if it's a process in time, then it has a past pole and a future pole. And we are processes in time as well. So I think this is one of the most interesting insights of Whitehead, because he showed that here is a clue to the so-called mind-body problem. Normally, people discuss the relation of mind and body in terms of spatial metaphors. The mind is inside, the body is outside, the external world, the inner life. We're used to this kind of talk. We've all talked in that way, I'm sure. But it's a spatial metaphor for mind. He thought that the best way of understanding it was in terms of time, that the future pole is the mental pole, that the past pole is the physical pole, that the relation of mind and body is a relation in time. The mind, the mental pole, is to do with possibilities. Possibilities don't yet exist. Possibilities are not material things. And the Schrödinger equation, which describes what will happen to an electron, it's at the fundamental level of quantum mechanics, is an equation which describes all the possible things that electron could do. As soon as the electron interacts with anything, measuring apparatus or a molecule or anything else, or the screen on an old-style TV set, all those possibilities collapse down to an observable fact. It's sometimes called the collapse of the wave function. And this collapse of the possibilities to an observable fact is what happens when you move from the mental pole. A decision or change comes about so that a decision among these possibilities is made, maybe by chance, maybe by choice, until a decision is made and a fact comes into being, but it's now in the past. When you detect the electron on a screen or an electron detector, it's already in the past. The same applies to us. Our minds are primarily concerned with possibilities. Our consciousness is an arena of possibility. Our dreams, too, are about possibilities, not actualities. And one of the things our minds do, the principal thing, according to this interpretation of Whitehead, is to choose among possibilities. That's what our consciousness is about. And so, for example, every one of us chose to be here today. When we were deciding whether to be here or not, there were many other possible things we could have done this Sunday afternoon. But out of those many possibilities, we chose to be here. And having chosen to be here and having put our decisions into action, we are here. And the fact we're here is an observable physical fact. We can be weighed, measured, photographed, etc., where we are right now. But the process that led to this was through a realm of possibility leading to a decision. And now our minds are concerned with future and other possibilities. I'm talking about new possibilities for science, for example. Anyway, I think that this approach is a really helpful one. And when we extend this panpsychist view to larger physical systems, we get into very interesting territory. I mean, most discussions focus on electrons, and for most of us it's a bit of a stretch to imagine the conscious life of an electron. But it gets much more interesting when we think about big self-organizing systems, not small ones. The whole of the Earth, for example, is a self-organizing system, Gaia. And the one that I'm most interested in is the Sun. Because from this point of view, the Sun as a self-organizing system will have a mind. The Sun will be conscious. Now, for most modern people, the idea that the Sun's conscious is something they haven't thought about at all. I once asked my friend Martin Rees, Martin, have you ever considered the possibility that the Sun's conscious? And he looked up from his Sunday Times that he was reading. The Sun conscious? I said, yes. And he said, of course not. And that was the end of the discussion. See, any educated person, and everyone in this room has been through the educational system, then knows that to say the Sun's conscious is animistic, involves anthropomorphic projections, is a primitive mode of thought. All traditional peoples believe the Sun is conscious. Indians believe the Sun is conscious. Surya is the sun god. Many Hindus every day start their day with the prostrations to the Sun, Surya Namaskar. It's a yoga exercise. I do it myself, and I'm sure some of you do it. The most important, one of the most important mantras of Hinduism, the Gayatri mantra, is an invocation to the Sun, the light of the divine light of the Sun to illuminate our meditation. But all of that's primitive, superstitious, and we as modern people have risen above it. We now know that the Sun is nothing but a hydrogen bomb governed by physical laws with electrical activity going on its surface. But what if the Sun is actually conscious? You see, it's hard even to ask the question, because the prejudice against asking it is reinforced in our culture by the fact that children think it's conscious, or at least implicitly. When they draw the Sun, they draw it with a smiley face. So that proves it's primitive, childish, and superstitious. And okay, these people used to believe that. It was a mythological mode of thought that science has led us beyond to a new and better view of the rational, scientific view of the world. But do we really know the Sun's unconscious? No one's ever done a single experiment, and I've never seen even a single discussion of the subject within any scientific literature, except to dismiss the very possibility as a childish superstition. But if the Sun's conscious, then we arrive at a completely new way of thinking. What kind of decisions could it make? If its consciousness, like ours, is concerned with possibilities and choosing among them. Well, I'm not suggesting that it can choose what orbit to follow. I don't think it can decide to deviate one way or the other from its regular orbit. But it has a huge amount of electrical activity within it, like our brains do, but much more complex than our brains. It shoots out solar flares and coronal mass ejections. It has 11-year sunspot cycles. All these things are highly variable, so variable that NASA has an online site with solar weather, because if it shoots solar flares out towards the Earth, they can cause power blackouts and interruption of communication systems. The Sun can modulate what's happening in the solar system through these activities, and it may do so consciously. If the Sun's doing that, so are other stars. All of the stars may have mental activity, minds, just as people thought in the Middle Ages. And If the stars have minds, then what about galaxies, which are even higher level self-organizing systems? The stars are like cells in the bodies of the galaxy. And the whole galaxy may have a mind, a galactic mind. Maybe the equivalent of the brain is at the galactic center, or the heart, which is an immensely energetic center of every galaxy that sends out power, plasma currents and magnetic field lines along the spiral arms, affecting everything within the galaxy. And then, if all the galaxies are conscious, what about the entire universe? The cosmic mind. What's the cosmic mind doing? See, there's nothing that makes this unscientific. It's simply not something discussed within existing science. But nowhere within existing institutions will you find, except CIIS, will you find discussions of this kind of issue. Because it's simply not on the agenda because of the taboo against it. I think when we break out of these taboos, and this is just one example of one of the taboos that I've discussed, entirely new possibilities open up for scientific investigation. And I think we've been liberated from this constricting philosophy of nature. And I think that our whole attitude to nature would be regenerated. I think the sciences themselves would be regenerated. I think all of this is good for science. I'm saying these things not because I'm anti-science, but because I'm pro-science. I spent my entire career in scientific research. I'm very pro-science. But I just think it's terrible the way that it's got so locked into these dogmatic points of view and that they're constricting science itself in such a limiting way. And I think it won't be long before we break out of them, because the old dogmas are breaking down in almost every area of science. I mentioned already the way they're breaking down in genetics and the theory of inheritance. And the same is true right across the board. But most people don't yet realize that we're entering a post-materialist world. There is a website which deals with this. Last year, a number of scientists and medical researchers gathered in Tucson, Arizona. We had something called the Summit on Post-Materialist Science. And one of the things we did was set up a website, which I recommend you take a look at, called opensciences.org. opensciences.org. Because there's now increasing numbers of people within the sciences who think along the lines I've been describing. And this website, it mentions educational institutions where you can learn about these things, funding agencies that help fund research in these areas. And there's a who's who of open-minded scientists with profiles of them. And there's a manifesto for post-materialist science, which has been signed by dozens of scientists within educational and medical institutions. So it's still small, but there is a growing movement now, and I think we're on the threshold of a massive paradigm change. Thank you.